Good morning, everyone. My name is Arif Shaon. I look after the digital preservation services at Qatar National Library, amongst other things. Unfortunately, my colleagues, whose name you may have seen in the program, Carol and Marcin, with whom I presented this, the abstract, submitted the abstract for this presentation, couldn't be here today, so I'm speaking on their behalf. So I'm going to talk about a small project that we did at the library towards the end of last year that sort of aimed to capture and preserve various websites containing information pertinent to the FIFA World Cup 2022, the Football World Cup, the recently concluded and was hosted in the country. It was truly a sort of a landmark event, not just in the history of the country, but also of the region, for it being the first ever Football World Cup to be hosted in that part of the world. So I'm going to talk about that project, but I'm also going to highlight some of the challenges we faced, but more importantly, the impact this project was expected to have on the overall library's strategy for web archiving and collection development. So let's see if this works. Is this one right? Oh, here we go. So there's some of the things I'd like to cover in the next 19 minutes. So I'd like to begin with a brief introduction or history of the library itself. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, the Qatar National Library is the newest national library in the world. At least last time I checked, since we opened our doors to the public back in 2018, I don't believe there's been another new national library. So it's an interesting bit of trivia. But building a national library in the 21st century was a strategic decision by the country, as it was deemed to play an important role in the country's transition from its heavy reliance on its carbon-based economy, which is basically based on natural oil and gas reserves, towards building a more sustainable knowledge-based economy. And this sort of realization and the vision is sort of deep embedded in every aspect of the library, including its design. I don't believe this picture does justice to the actual, how the building looks. And if you're in the country, I strongly encourage you to sort of visit the library. You won't miss it. You won't regret it. And there's a bit of an interesting bit of Dutch connection to the library design, considering the fact that I'm standing here at the National Institute of Sound and Vision, Netherlands Institute of Sound and Vision, giving this talk. The library building was designed by the world-renowned Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas. And it's sort of designed in a way that it's two papers sort of pulled apart, then folded diagonally to make a sort of shell-like structure. Once again, this picture doesn't justice. So if you can look, if you're interested, you can Google it to see sort of a better picture of the building. But just in terms of the, sorry, okay. So if through the library's vision and mission, the main goal, or the goal is to sort of establish the library as a sort of a center for all different types of knowledge, including learning, research, and culture, while sort of guarding or being a custodian of not just the regions, but also not just the nations, but also the regions' different types of intellectual heritage and cultural heritage. So to fulfill that mission, the library commits to collecting, preserving, curating, and sort of sharing a wide variety of knowledge, both local and global, as long as it's relevant to the country and the region. So archiving web resources or websites containing such culturally important and also scholarly important information is deemed a crucial part of the library's mission. But despite that sort of realization or the understanding of the importance of web archiving, this project I'm going to talk about is truly the first officially mandated project the web archiving project that we've ever done. This is not to say that we didn't dabble in web archiving before. There's a few years ago we did sort of do a bit of a web archiving in an unofficial capacity, and I think I presented that at a WACnet conference or webinar a couple of years ago. But this is truly sort of the first mandate. So we actually had a mandate from our executive director to do this project. So this was seen as a golden opportunity to build a platform on which you could build more sustainable and operational web archiving service. And more on that later. So about the project itself, as I mentioned, aim was to sort of capture various websites containing information related to the World Cup. But I guess the wider goal was to sort of capture the experiences of different groups of people, including the fans, the players, and of course the organizers, not just during the World Cup itself, but also the journey towards that event, and also the aftermath of it all. And the wider goal was to sort of preserve such information so that it could be shared with the future generations of users, who could also share that experience to an extent, and as well as sort of appreciating the astounding effort by their country to host such a massive, culturally important and global event. So that was pretty much the kind of the mandate of the project, and the time frame that we had was quite sort of tight. So we had the mandate from our executive director sort of in the last week of September 2022, and the project was to sort of run from the October till January 2023. So the main goal was to sort of start crawling a couple of weeks prior to the actual, the event would actually commence, and then it will continue throughout the event and until a few weeks afterwards. So here's some of the project deliverables. So of course we couldn't just go and sort of capture every single website, because truth be told, just leading up to the event there had been an increasing amount of sort of media coverage. So it was impractical for us to sort of target every single website that had anything to do with the World Cup. So we had to be strategic and selective. So one of the deliverables was to come up with a selection criteria, and of course that would result into a list of websites that would be crawled along with the associated descriptive metadata, because the ultimate goal is to sort of publish this or make this these websites sort of discoverable and usable, and for which we need as much metadata as possible. Another deliverable was to actually find an efficient technical solution for doing the crawling. Because as I mentioned, when we did the crawling earlier, for a few years ago, we used Heritrix, and I'm sure you're aware that Heritrix has its fair share of challenges and difficulties, especially for crawling websites that are very, heavy with JavaScripts, animations, and sort of other sort of dynamic content. So we wanted to use this opportunity to find something more efficient, and of course the archived websites would go into the our preservation system for digital preservation and curation. So the impact this project was expected to have was much bigger than, or at least more important to us than the project deliverables. But as I said, this was the there was the first sort of mandated, web archiving project that we had. So we really wanted to use this opportunity to build a foundation for developing a more sustainable and sort of more of an operational web archiving service. So the particular focus was given to sort of articulate various aspects of web archiving workflow, including the selection criteria, processes, and more importantly the governance, the roles and responsibilities. And this was while demonstrating use of best practices where possible. But this was also an opportunity to sort of assess our own capacity to do such work. So were we really capable of doing such work? Well, would we be capable of doing this kind of work going forward? So it's kind of allowed us to take a stock of what our technical expertise or capabilities, identify any gaps that would need to be addressed going forward. And the ultimate goal would be to sort of find an optimum balance between what our capacity is and what's our what the expectations are from various stakeholders. So that was the impact that the project was expected to have, but there was a challenge. And this challenge was something that wasn't surprising to us, because we had run into this beast before a couple of years ago. And in fact, if we had the legal deposit, this wouldn't have been an issue. So, and why we don't have the legal deposit, that's something I'm not at liberty to discuss in the scope of this presentation. But if you're interested, you can come and find me later on. I can tell you what that's about. But we don't have the legal deposit, but we have this particular law that, in a nutshell, kind of prohibits us from disseminating or sharing anything, any sort of archived or harvested web-based resources from anybody, whether it's over the web or even on premise within a sort of within the library building. So in a nutshell, we could crawl, but we couldn't really sort of share with anybody. So to get around that, the project strategy was to, as I mentioned, the crawl, collect, curate, and preserve, but not publish until we figure out how to how to sort of deal with that aspect of that. So based on the realization that we couldn't really sort of publish the websites that we were to crawl, so the executive director sort of initiated another sort of parallel initiative that would focus on developing a sort of a process, sort of a sustainable process for securing permissions and or rights from the website owners, for disseminating the harvested websites. So there was the only way, in lieu of legal deposit, we could actually disseminate such websites. So and the aim of the FIFA World Cup archiving project was to sort of collaborate with this particular initiative, inform the initiative based on the lessons learned and sort of other aspects of the project. We were also strategic about what sort of websites we would crawl. We specifically excluded any newspapers websites because this was being handled by another sort of initiative within the library, not necessarily as a web archiving activity, but sort of more of a sort of a newspaper archiving activity. So we felt that it was unnecessary to sort of target those websites. So in terms of the project governance, we wanted to ensure that there was an institutional approach to the project. This was not only to show that this was not only to ensure the project success, but also to show that how such governance would look like for an operational sort of service for the library. So for this service to be for not just for the project but also for the service to be successful and efficient, it couldn't be just specific to a particular department. It needed buy-ins from sort of all key stakeholders within the library. So this was a good opportunity to kind of showcase or show that there are different stakeholders could come in to do such work. So as you can see, we had the executive director being the sponsor of the project, and my department, digital collections, were the lead stakeholders or the custodians of the harvested websites. We also dealt with copyrights and licensing. IT assisted in getting a technical solution, as well as providing the underlying cloud storage for the archived websites. But we also, more importantly, we had research and learning and children's library, who really took the responsibility for not only developing the selection criteria, but also selecting the websites, as well as collecting the associated descriptive metadata. So it was truly an institutional sort of effort. Okay, let's look at the selection criteria. So it's nothing groundbreaking there. So we targeted, the websites that were, preferably both English and Arabic, Arabic being the national language. But we also targeted websites that were not likely to be sort of crawled by sort of other organizations such as the Internet Archive. So the local websites covering different aspects related to the World Cup, such as the travel, food, accommodation, the websites connected to media, social media accounts. We also targeted a few government websites because during that World Cup and also the leading up to it, they were publishing various reforms and changes to the immigration laws, as well as social policies and so on. So it was important to capture that. So in terms of the frequency, there were only a handful of websites that we thought would be worth crawling on daily basis, but the majority of them were crawled on weekly basis, and the government and the websites and more specific sections within the government websites were crawled as a one-time because they weren't really publishing content as frequently as the others. Okay, so in terms of the crawling solution, as I said, we needed a crawling solution which is a little bit more efficient than Heritrix. So naturally, we looked at some in-house solution based on something called Browser. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Browser. At least the Internet Archive's folks are, because they're the one who built it. But the Browser is an interesting way of crawling because it actually fires up a browser and it crawls a website as a normal human being would do. So you can really get around all this capture business and sort of if you have that in place. So this was also good for us because having that would mean that there wouldn't be any additional cost. But we did run into a problem that in the end sort of prevented us from going forward with this, because we discovered that to run, and this is something we didn't learn just a couple of years ago when we did web archiving in an unofficial way. I mean, it was anyway. So let's not get into that. But in this case, we discovered, since we were doing it in an official capacity, we discovered that any crawling activity run within the country from an IP address of associated with a Qatari organization needed permission from this particular branch of the Qatar's cybersecurity agency, or whatever that's called. But this particular agency, the branch is called National Strength and Conditioning Association, NSCA. So we needed permission from them to even go and crawl any websites, whether it's in the country or outside. And as you can imagine, that process was deemed to be quite substantial. We sent out emails, but and it was basically deemed infeasible within the project timeframe. It would have taken months for us to even get approval. So naturally, we looked at the other option, which is the externally hosted solution. And the only thing we looked at was the Internet Archive's Archivit. Obviously, it meant that there was some additional cost, which is subscription-based cost based on the projected usage of the storage provided by Internet Archive. And the overall procurement process was could have been lengthy, but we had some help from our executive director and other sort of influential bodies. And more importantly, what it meant that we didn't need NSCA clearance because the crawling was run on the Internet Archive's IP address. So as far as the IP address was not somehow traced back to us, they were happy with that one. So we ended up going for that. So I'm sure there's some questions. I mean, if somebody asked the right question, they could obviously trace it back to us. But for now, given the time frame, I think this was the right way to go. So we ended up going for that one. Now, this is kind of a look at, I'm not sure if you can see that. So we had a very manual but efficient approach towards selecting websites. So we had the children's library sort of prepare a spreadsheet, and they would collect various metadata about the websites that would be selecting. As you can see, the metadata elements resemble quite heavily Dublin Core, but there's also some additional information about the rationale for selecting a website and so on. And this is kind of a summary of what we ended up doing. So we ended up selecting 55 sort of URLs or seeds, which resulted into 420 gigabytes of crawl websites. The number is nothing compared to some of the numbers I've seen over the last past couple of days. But as I said, this is the early days for us. But this really gave us an insight into the type of data volume that we would have to deal with going forward. So this was useful for us. So this is just as I said, I can't legally show you the crawl websites, but I can probably give you some, share some screenshots with you. So this is if I'm not mistaken, this is a community-driven sort of a website that that was publishing various opinion pieces around the World Cup, whether it's the sustainability of the new road networks or sort of other related aspects. There's another one which basically had a story. It would publish a story every time a new stadium would open. And this was actually a radio website for a radio station in Arabic. I can't read Arabic, so I'm sure it had some interesting things to say in there. So this is just a couple of examples of some of the websites that we ended up crawling. And of course, as the final deliverable, we used the Archivit's API to download all the WAC files along with the descriptive metadata, and we used a bunch of Python scripts to create submission information packages, which would include the WAC files, the crawl level descriptive metadata, as well as some technical metadata according to the library's digital preservation policy. And all of them would be ingested into library's archive Medica-based digital preservation system, and the resulting AIPs would be stored in a dark archive for us to figure out how to sort of share it with the wider audience. So that's the project in a nutshell. Now, what we're doing now. So as I mentioned that there was a separate sort of parallel initiative that sort of commenced around the same time as this project, which focused on developing a process for obtaining permissions from the website owners for the purpose of dissemination and so on. So far, it's been a long process, various discussions with various stakeholders and so on. But what we've done so far is that we now have an officially sort of endorsed or approved letter of intent. It was endorsed by our executive director as well as our communication department, which would basically go out to every single website owner owner of a website that's selected for crawling. And this essentially works as sort of a sales pitch to the website owner, why it's beneficial for them for their website to be added to our collection. So what it means for us, whether we would preserve it, we would promote their website and so on. And there's the letter also has a bit of has an approach which could be interpreted as crawl until heard otherwise. So you give them a 30-day sort of time frame for them to sort of get back to us, and if they have any objection about their website being crawled, and if they would like the website to be withdrawn. So that's that one month sort of time frame. But this is not to say that if they come back to us a few months later and if they have a strong case for the website to be withdrawn, we wouldn't comply with that. We would. But this letter also serves as a sort of a initial kind of contact with it's intended to establish a dialogue with the website owner for the dissemination purposes. But as I said, this letter has just gone out I think it's a couple of weeks ago. We're yet to see the impact of the result of that. But the ultimate goal is if we can get around this issue, then we will ingest all these archived websites into our digital repository, which would have an integrated replay service, which currently doesn't exist at the moment. But let's see how that one goes. Finally, so as I mentioned, the website, archiving, the websites or web archiving is an important part of the library's mission and vision. And this particular project is truly seen as a sort of a foundation building exercise. So I think it's given us a unique opportunity or a useful opportunity to sort of see how web archiving could be done in an official capacity. And we've identified some unique challenges that we hadn't seen before, especially with the clearance from the NCSA. But we also realized that this is something we couldn't do alone. So we need to be engaging with the wider communities to sort of understand how they're doing it, how their experiences could also benefit us, and perhaps we could also share some of our experiences and lessons learned as well. I think that's it, and thank you for listening. And if you're interested in the Law Number 7/2002, then there's a link to it as well. Thank you.